Hey everyone, it's Dr. Feist here again, talking to you about Aristotle, and of course I'm teaching on the Nicomachean ethics that's starting up. Now, what I want to do in this video is just kind of give you a bird's eye view of the Nicomachean ethics, sort of an overview of what it is, a little bit on its structure, and what sort of is the main idea that I think is going on in this. So what I've got here is the governing idea from the Nicomachean ethics. It comes in Book 2, Chapter 2, and the quotation is located at the Becker numbers 1103b 27 to 30. The Becker numbers are the page numbers that are put in the margins of Aristotle's works. And if you want a little more information, you can just Google that. That's easy to find. So I will give often the references according to the Becker numbers, not the regular page numbers that are at the bottom of the page or whatnot. The value of these things is that they're the same no matter which translation or edition you have. So if you'd use a different translation than I'm using in the course, you can still find out the exact quotation or the section that I'm talking about by using these Becker numbers. If I gave page numbers, it would be a nightmare to try and figure that out. Okay, so what's the subject matter of ethics? Aristotle tells us that it's arete, basically what we would now translate, and I hesitate to always translate these Greek words because the minute you translate it, you start thinking about them in terms of English and even more about the way you've heard them or used them. Keep in mind that Aristotle is going to use a lot of terms in a very technical way. So when you're introduced to the terms, keep in mind that it's a specific technical term. Now, arete is often translated as virtue. So that's the key thing, is we're studying arete. So I'm going to try and use these Greek words just to keep you in mind that these are technical terms, and they're technical terms from Aristotle, a person from the distant past. So we take up the subject matter of ethics. Why do we do that? What's the point of taking up this? Well, we're learning about virtue. But we're not just learning about it to get knowledge of virtue. The point is to get knowledge, yes, but to do something with that knowledge. And the purpose is not to merely contemplate virtue. The purpose is to put it into practice. So Aristotle's thought is, at least on ethics, is extremely practical. It's all about becoming a kind of person, namely the virtuous person, someone who possesses arete. What exactly is that? Well, don't worry about that. We'll find it out later, but it's going to be connected to a number of other technical terms, and I'll introduce them as we go along through the text, what they mean and how they connect to arete. But think of arete as kind of like a skill or an ability. And how do you get skills and abilities? Well, it involves some learning in the abstract sense. You got to kind of have an understanding of what they are, but mostly you learn skills and abilities through practice. So how do you become a good person? Well, by acting like a good person. So in other words, you learn a little bit about what it means to be good, what it's all about, and then you go out and you do these good things. And you need to know what to do in order to do good things. And eventually, being good, being virtuous, having arete, will just become part of who you are and the way that you exist in the world. And the goal is to become someone that is naturally virtuous, that virtue comes easy. It's the kind of person that easily does the right thing, doesn't have to really struggle with what is the right thing to do, knows what it is, and then doesn't have the other struggle that many people have when they know what the right thing is to do and they don't really want to do it or they don't have the energy to do it. No, the virtuous person, according to Aristotle, is at ease with virtue. It's not just part of them, it's just their way of being in the world, as we might say today. So that's the goal, is to get this knowledge and to put it into practice and to shape the kind of person that we're going to be. So it's a very well-rounded philosophical approach. It's not merely just what to do in a certain situation, it's what kind of person to be in general. And Aristotle thinks that virtue, arete, is extremely valuable in a number of ways. Not just simply doing the right thing, but a lot more. What's this lot more? That remains to be seen when we dig more deeply into the Nicomachean ethics. But I think it's always helpful to start off when studying a philosophical text to do something an old professor of mine many years ago said to me: read the table of contents. Get an idea, get an overview, skim around, jump around in the book. Don't be hasty. Just simply take a look at little passages here and there, but read the table of contents. So with that in mind, I've got this overview of the Nicomachean ethics structure. What is it? Well, it consists of 10 books. And these books cover a wide variety of aspects. You can think of the Nicomachean ethics as a kind of how-to manual. And it is, in many ways, an early version of what we now think of as books like How to Be Happy, How to Become a Better Person and Be Happy While Doing It. That's what this is all about. Early philosophy, despite what a lot of people think, early philosophy was extremely concerned with how to live a good life. And if you do some historical research and you come to realize what it was like to live in ancient Greece, it was rough. Life was very difficult. As one would imagine. Just imagine people died from very simple things like an impacted wisdom tooth and things like that we now, at least in many countries, take for granted today that we can solve. So life back then was rough, and philosophers often struggle to ask and to answer the question, what is the good life? That's what this book is all about. So in book 1, which is what we'll talk about in a lot of detail because it sets the stage for all the other books, book 1 is essentially about the greatest human good. And this greatest human good we'll see written it out in the Greek script is Eudaimonia. What is that? Eudaimonia is a Greek term. It has a variety of translations. Again, most of the translations, well, actually all the translations I've ever seen, don't quite get what this word is about in Greek. However, it's been translated in a variety of ways like happiness, well-being, flourishing. There's a number of them. We'll look at a variety of them. I would suggest that you just think in terms of the term eudaimonia rather than trying to translate it. And as you read Aristotle, let what he says fill out what you think eudaimonia is, rather than trying to run to an English translation or whatever, and then using all the connotations of English with respect to a particular translation, and then letting that color the text. You don't want to do that. That's going to be reading what we think into the text. Our job as scholars and thinkers is not to read what we think should be there, but to read what is there, at least as best we can. It's always hard not to bring one's prejudices. But coming up with a translation and then using that translation is a good way of distorting what Aristotle means. So, book 1 is all about this greatest good that we have, this greatest human good called eudaimonia. Book 2 and 3, these talk a lot about good character. They go into the details of what makes a person have good character. How do we work that into our philosophy and our way of life? Now, I mentioned that it's all about arete. So we've got two terms going on here, eudaimonia and arete. How are those going to link up? Well, again, let's plow our way through the text and see how Aristotle connects all of these things. And arete, I said, is translated by virtue. We normally think, the problem is, again, when you use the English term virtue, you normally think about it as kind of moral and having to do with right and wrong and all that. It's true, Aristotle has that in his work as well. But just be careful about reading that as the complete notion of arete. Aristotle breaks it up. In books 4 and 5, he talks about kind of what we would think as moral arete. In book 6, though, he changes and uses arete in a way that we're not really used to, and he talks about it in an intellectual way, or in the intellectual virtues, so the moral virtues and the intellectual virtues. In book 7, he talks about strength, moral weakness. So we've got moral strength, moral weakness. In books 8 and 9, very famous books, hugely influential in the Renaissance. These are discussions of friendship. And in that, Aristotle goes into the details of what does it mean to be a friend? What does it mean to have a friend? And basically, he's talking about human relationships. Very interesting discussions there that we'll look at. And then finally, book 10, which I like to call the problem book, because there's a lot of tensions in book 10, and the tensions are between 10 and the rest. So some people have said, some scholars have argued that actually it's a tack-on, it's an add-on thing. Keep in mind that they didn't have publication in the way that we do now. So books, these ancient texts that come to us have been edited and organized by different editors throughout history. But book 10, it discusses eudaimonia with respect to pleasure. So you get into discussions about pleasure. What's its role? How does it link up with eudaimonia? How does it link to the moral virtues, the intellectual virtues? How does all that work? So what's pleasure and arete? Right? Is the good life one of pleasure? What does that mean? Or is pleasure just something that's okay, but don't make it the basis of your life? That's a bad idea. And then, of course, as I said, there is some tension because even the notion of eudaimonia that Aristotle articulates and kind of flows throughout the text seems to be challenged down here. So just for now, we'll just think of it in terms of there are some tensions between book 10 and the rest of the books that comprise what we call the Nicomachean ethics. Now, one other note, Aristotle is a tough read, admittedly. His text can be somewhat dry and difficult, and some passages are fairly tortured and translators struggle with them. And if you go back to the ancient Greek, it's not even always grammatically complete. So the text is, as they say, in the translation and the historical business, the texts are in places corrupted. We're not quite sure, given the centuries of things being passed down, stuff gets eliminated, stuff maybe is added. What we think is that the Nicomachean Ethics really, as many of Aristotle's works, these are collections of notes. They might be, nobody can say absolutely they're even from the pen of Aristotle, although there's large-scale agreement this is Aristotle's work, and it could be more of his lecture notes rather than a polished work, because some ancient authors referred to Aristotle's elegant writings and his dialogues, and we don't really have anything like that anymore, which is a terrible shame. So unlike Plato, we don't really have Aristotle's polished works. So we do the best with what we can. And if you don't read Greek, always be aware that you are in many ways at the mercy of translators, because certain passages look very different depending on how you translate them. They can either, and I'll try to point this out as we go along, some passages, if you translate them in certain ways, they will look very dogmatic, very assertive. But if you use a different translation and you use a different way of understanding some of the verbs that Aristotle uses, he looks much more, shall we say, open-minded, much more curious, much more examining, rather than always asserting. So there you go. There's the rough governing idea. Arete, virtue, that's what we're really trying to understand. How are we going to get to this arete? Well, as a preliminary link, we're going to look at one of the greatest sort of goods that we have. We have all kinds of goods, but the big one is going to be eudaimonia. It has a variety of translations. We talked a little bit about that. And then unpacking what eudaimonia means throughout the rest of the books and the rest of the videos on this great work called the Nicomachean Ethics. Now, there's a couple of things I want you to keep in mind as we read. So some criticisms, now I shift over here to some criticisms to keep in mind when we talk about Aristotle. Aristotle is, you can call him old-fashioned, you can call him conservative, a variety of things. Why is he conservative? Well, I hope to unpack that as we go through the text, but there have been a number of general criticisms that are good to keep in mind when you're reading Aristotle. And I'm not saying that these criticisms are right. I'm just saying they're good to keep in mind because a good criticism can help you look at the text more critically and try to answer that criticism. And attempts to look at texts carefully and trying to answer criticism is a more scholarly way of reading the text, and that's what we're after. So we're trying to keep as unbiased as we can and as critical as we can when we read these texts. So what what's one criticism to keep in mind? Well, first off, the notion of essences. We'll get more into detail as we go through, but Aristotle has lots of essences in his work. This is something he inherited from Plato, although he modified it. So it's not exactly what Plato thought, but it's in the realm, or the, shall we say, the spirit of Plato. And so in this sense, Aristotle thought there were essences. And what is very strong in Aristotle is there is an essence to being human. There is, shall we say, a kind of human nature, what it is to be a human being. It's not up for grabs, according to Aristotle. We are creatures in the world. There's an essence to being a human being, just like there's an essence to being a bird or a tree or any of these things. His world was quite well ordered, and these essences were fixed. Just like when you think of when Darwin caused a great revolution by talking about evolution of species, that species themselves are not fixed. They change over time. They come and go, and they morph in. They come out of other species. They morph into new ones, etc., etc. None of that in Aristotle. Aristotle's world is a world of fixed essences. It's logical and it's ordered. It's not perfectly ordered. There are some haphazard activities, or I shouldn't say activities, but more, there are haphazard events from time to time, but by and large, the world is very well ordered. And if you look in Aristotle's metaphysics, it stresses this greatly, and some of that crops up and appears in his works on the ethics. So the criticism is there really such a thing as a human essence? Is there really such a thing as human nature? That has come under a lot of fire. And this has been typically associated with kind of conservative views, and opposed to liberal views, which have more open-ended understandings of what it is to be a person. There's all kinds of ways to be a human being. And another one is the notion of the culture. So for Aristotle, some people say that his ethics, when you carefully go through it, as we will, that it's ultimately linked to the ancient Greek culture. And there's a lot to be said for that, because when Aristotle does list what he calls the virtues, these kinds of skills that you have in order to achieve eudaimonia, it's not terribly surprising that they reflect the values that were praised or held in great respect in his society. So is Aristotle really just giving us what it is to be a cultured person in ancient Greece in his time? Is it really tied to a particular place and time? And is that the whole problem when you do ethics in the style that Aristotle does? What you do is you end up with a very culture-bound notion of ethics. And wasn't ethics supposed to be universal? Wasn't it supposed to be above all that stuff and allow us to look at different cultures, etc., etc.? Some people say, no, Aristotle won't give you that. We'll see. Again, but it's a good idea to always be asking yourself, you know, are these essences too restrictive? Is this too restrictive in terms of culture? And then, last but not least, about the restrictive, sort of these two restrictive criticisms, is the notion that Aristotle, at the end of it all, doesn't really help us out all that much. For instance, if he's talking about these essences, about what it is to be human, you know, what if you react to that? What if you don't like it? What choice? Are you not really a human, or what's going on here? So, how is this really useful? Is it oppressive? Is it telling people who they are, no matter what they think they are? And in the end, when we look more detail, it's hard to understand this criticism right now, but when you look more in detail at what Aristotle says virtue is, what I want you to be thinking about is, how helpful is this to me? Because remember, the governing idea of the Nicomachean ethics is all about it's not just contemplation, but it is all about practice. It is all about becoming a virtuous person, becoming a good person, and ultimately achieving this eudaimonia. Well, does it? Right? That's a claim. Does he help us actually do that? Or is it really questionable as to whether or not this whole enterprise of Aristotle's is even useful. So keep those in mind, and there's lots more to come. There's plenty of criticisms of Aristotle, and people either try to say that it's all useless and should be thrown aside, as people like Mill and Kant essentially did, especially Kant. But others have said no, and the modern virtue ethics movement has tried to rehabilitate Aristotle, tried to take what's good and leave what's bad. So we'll look at that as well. All right, so now that we've got the overview of the Nicomachean ethics and some of its criticisms, I'd like to step into Book 1. Now, each book is divided into chapters, and what I want to look at in this video is just an overview of Book 1. It has 13 chapters in it. And in this sense, this is the blueprint. This is the book that lays out, shall we say, or articulates the skeleton that the other books are going to try to flesh out. So, first one, chapters 1 and 2. This is going to look at the chief good, the main good for humans, the chief good. What is, and that there is one, that there is some kind of good that is for humans. It's not a divine good or whatnot. There is a special kind of good. Aristotle tries to say roughly what that is. That's going to be linking up with the whole idea of eudaimonia. What is that? Chapter 3, he's going to talk a little bit about method. Takes a little break. Aristotle gives us what the chief good is, then he takes a break, talks a little bit about method. Chapter 4, he returns again to the chief good and articulates and talks a little bit about happiness, right, which is the standard translation of eudaimonia. But I'm going to put it in scare quotes, so always be careful because we're really talking about eudaimonia. Then, as he goes on, he says that happiness is a familiar thing. We all basically agree that the good, the chief good, we're all out for is happiness. That's what we want. That's what we want out of life. And it's something that you want in and of itself. You may want money, and people say, why do you want money? Well, money will make me happy. It'd be odd if someone said, I want to be happy in order to make money. That seems to be the reverse. So Aristotle says there is something that we all agree on as the chief good, and that is eudaimonia, or happiness. Chapters 5 and 6, we look at some views. Aristotle loves doing this. Aristotle always, he's one of the first philosophers in history to do this, is to canvass previous views and general views. So he is doing, in many ways, kind of a sociology and history. So he looks at different views of the good. Then we get, in 7, we get Aristotle. Of the good. So he looks at a variety of it, so there's sort of a first glance at it, then some more particular views of it, ones that he thinks are worthy of looking at, and then he offers his take on it, and he gets more involved now. He's going to get more involved into what he really thinks the good is and what the human good is, and he will dig into a more developed argument as to what it is, and we'll have a look at that when we get to that. Then in chapters 8 and 9, he's going to bring in some contrasts. He'll take his views and look at them against others. So Aristotle is trying to be basically a well-rounded sociologist, empirical approach to these things by looking at what others say, contrasting what he says, trying to work out. So this is a good exercise by Aristotle of a philosopher at work, trying out ideas, looking at what others say, and then trying to flesh out your own. Chapters 10 and 11, again, he will look at the fact that it's mortal happiness connected to us as human beings, not as gods. And why does he have to worry about that? Well, in his day, we will see that there wasn't this drastic distinction between ordinary human lives and divine beings. As a matter of fact, the term eudaimonia, I'll talk about that in another video as we get more into it, had a kind of otherworldly, or divine tinge to it, and we'll see what that means. So Aristotle wants to clearly show us that he's talking about mortals, what we are. Chapter 12, and what we are vis-a-vis happiness. Chapter 12 is what should our relationship, what should that be to eudaimonia? Is it something to praise, to glorify? How should we think of it? How should we think about it in terms of our lives? And then on chapter 13, the final one, he'll get more into arete, the distinctions between the arete of character, sort of the moral side of things, and the arete of intelligence. And that, then, these 13 chapters really is the book, the skeleton, as I said, of the book, and the rest of it will flesh it out. So, I'm going to stop here now, but what I'm going to do then is start diving in the next video into this notion of eudaimonia and the chief good and how Aristotle begins to articulate that. See you next video.